Welcome, everyone, to the first part of the language chapter. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So, a quick little introduction to the topic of language here. Language is something that is incredibly widespread. It is perhaps, and this is debatable, this is a very hot topic, but most psychologists would agree that language is what makes us human. Language is what differentiates us from every other species of animal on the planet. We'll talk quite a bit about that in the next lecture, but suffice it to say that language is incredibly important for the human experience. Every single society on Earth, every single human society on Earth that has ever existed or will ever exist, will have some form of language. Every healthy person on the planet has the ability to use language. So it is something that is widespread. It exists all across the globe. It exists in every single person. It's estimated that on the planet right now, there are somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages spoken. That number is getting smaller literally every day as the number of speakers of unique languages gets smaller and smaller. Languages on planet Earth are getting more and more homogenized, and that also is a topic of much debate. On one end of the continuum, we have Mandarin Chinese, which is spoken by roughly 1 billion people. And then on the other side of the continuum, we have many languages that are spoken by a few dozen or maybe even a handful of people, or in some extreme cases, like the language of Wichita, which is a native group that existed in what is now the state of Kansas. For a while, the language of Wichita was spoken by one person, Doris McLemore. She unfortunately passed away not too long ago, and she was the last known speaker of the Wichita language. That is a picture of her on the right side of the screen, and that is something that she said there. I would like for the children to know how the Wichita language sounded. You can imagine how heavy of a responsibility that might be to be the last speaker, the last known speaker of a language. Sounds a bit lonely if you ask me. All right, so what is language? What is it for? The purpose of language is to share information. That is the fundamental use of our language abilities. Now, what do I mean by share information? Well, that can take many different forms. We can share emotions with one another. We can let people know if we're angry, if we're sad, if we're frightened, if we're happy. Maybe we can share emotions like love, feelings of gratitude. Sharing emotions is something that is incredibly important for having a coherent, well functioning society. The ability to share emotions, like I said, when you're happy, upset, in love, whatever, that's pretty important to be able to share that information with another person, or sometimes with more than one person. Uh, Knowledge is another important piece of information that we share with one another through the use of language. Language is one of the most important ways that generational knowledge is passed between generations. That is the basis of culture, that information is passed from one generation to the next. So, not only between generations, but also between individuals. You are a college student and you are hoping to gain some knowledge by taking this class and all your other classes. So, this is a pretty important way that humans are able to share not only what's going on in their own head, but also maybe a little bit of important piece of knowledge that they might have floating around up there. It's super important, and it allows us to do a couple pretty special things that no other animal on this planet can do. We can coordinate group behavior in some incredibly complex ways. I'm thinking specifically back in our evolutionary past, coordinating hunting behavior. This gave us a huge advantage over some of the other predators that existed at the time. On top of that, fast forward to today's age, and through things like the internet, cell phones, we're able to coordinate some pretty complex group behavior as well. We have countries that consist of millions and millions of people, and despite many difficulties, more or less we're able to stay as one coherent, somewhat peaceful group. Also, sharing knowledge allows us to solve problems. So let's say you're trying to figure out how to make a spear, a weapon to kill an animal and eat it. Well, maybe you're struggling to figure out how to do that, but maybe one of your clansmen or clanswomen figured out how to do it a long time ago, and they can share that knowledge with you. So language, super useful, not only in our evolutionary past, but for pretty common problems that we come across today. I mean, how many times have you Googled the answer to a question? Language can be written or spoken, but we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. All right, moving on. So if you had to summarize what language is in one sentence or one phrase, here it is at the top of the slide. Language is a rule-based system of symbolic codes. So let's unpack that quite a bit. A rule-based system of symbolic codes. So what's a symbol? Well, a symbol is something that represents something else. Now, I know that sounds super vague, so let's get a couple examples here. So in spoken language, a spoken word represents a real-world object, a real-world event, actions, people, feelings, or many other different examples out there. So let's just one example, the word dog. You've got three phonemes there. We'll talk about what a phoneme is in just a second. You hear the word dog and you think of a four-legged, fuzzy-faced creature with a tail who's probably pretty happy to see you. That spoken word of dog is a symbol that represents a real-world animal, something that you could encounter out in your daily life. So we use spoken words to represent almost anything conceivable in the human experience. Objects, events, actions, people, feelings. Anything that you could conceivably encounter in your life, there's a word or a group of words that could be used to represent that thing. So that's what a symbol is. For written language, we use written words. So if you saw the word dog written out, that would make you think of the same four-legged, fuzzy-faced critter with a tail. One of the important things to understand here is that the relationship between a symbol and what that symbol represents is arbitrary. What I mean is you can't look at the word cat, you can't hear the word cat and know what in the world a cat is unless you know that language. So to explain this a little better, imagine you are an alien from another planet, you've never heard a human language spoken before in your life, and you hear the word cat. There is no information in the word cat that leads you to understand what a cat is. You and I only know what a cat is because we are fluent speakers of English. We have a lot of experience with the word cat, and we know what a cat is. But if you were to be exposed to a foreign language that you have no experience with, maybe Serbian, and you heard the word cat in the Serbian language, which I have no idea what it is, you would have no way to know that that word was referring to a cat. So this is what I mean by an arbitrary relationship. The word cat contains no information whatsoever to lead you to believe what a cat is, unless you are an English speaker. So symbols and what they represent, that relationship is arbitrary. That's an important feature of what a language is. All right, so let's get down to some of the nitty-gritty building blocks of language, and we're going to start with phonemes. A phoneme is the smallest distinctive sound unit of a language. So if you break up all the different sounds that you can make in a language, words, syllables, individual phonemes, the smallest unit that you can break a language down into is called a phoneme. Now, phonemes are not the same thing as letters. For example, the English language has 44 phonemes. There's 44 unique sounds that are required to speak the English language. But as we all know, the English language, the written version of it, only has 26 letters. So letters and phonemes are not the same thing. Just as an example here, the word fight at the bottom of the slide, that has 5 letters, but only 3 phonemes. You've got the initial consonant F, the F sound. You've got the middle vowel sound, I. You've got the ending consonant sound, the T sound. So fight, you've got 3 phonemes, but again, you've got 5 letters. The G and the H are totally silent. So that's a little bit about phonemes. The human vocal system can produce a total of 869 phonemes. 869 different distinct sounds that the human auditory system can distinguish between. So if you take a look at the previous slide where I said English only has 44 phonemes, that means if you are a fluent English speaker and you are exposed to English almost exclusively throughout your day, I would put myself in that category. There are over 800 other phonemes out there that you are simply not exposed to in your daily life. Now, when we're really young and we are learning language, so in our first few years of life, the vast majority of people in the United States are only exposed to one language. The United States is, by and large, a country of monolinguals. People who speak more than one language are the exception to the rule in the United States. And the United States, in and of itself, is kind of a unique country for that as well. Most countries are not monolingual. Most countries, most people living in other countries speak more than one language. Americans are pretty unique for only speaking English for the most part. So when we are young, and let's say we are growing up in one of those monolingual households where only English is spoken, and you're only exposed to English for the most part, and you get to, let's say, age 7 or 8. After that, it becomes quite a bit more difficult to learn the phonemes outside of your native language that you've been exposed to your whole life up until that point. An example of this would be the rolling R's that we often hear in the Spanish language. If you are a native English speaker, you've only spoken English your whole life, that rolling R sound is very difficult to produce. You haven't had very much experience producing it. It's certainly something that we can hear pretty easily, but producing it is very difficult for us. But if you've ever heard little children speak Spanish, they have absolutely no problem whatsoever producing that really cool rolling R sound. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because I have no skill in that department. All right. Oh, another example here would be the ich sound in German. That is a phoneme that does not exist in the English language, and it actually takes a little bit of time to learn how to produce that. So, this ability to produce and discriminate between, so what I mean by discriminate between is to hear, this ability to discriminate between all 869 human phonemes is an ability that we lose, and we lose the ability after about a year of life. So before a year, we are kind of a blank slate. But after a year of listening to the languages that we are exposed to in the first year of our life, that window kind of closes, and our speech facilities in the brain kind of become specialized in one or two or three or four languages that we're exposed to. This is research that was done by a woman named Janet Worker. I have a video showing some of the research that's done in her lab with very young children. I will link that video on the Canvas website. Make sure to check that out. She does some pretty cool stuff, and it really shows that we do lose this ability after about 1 year of life. She plays some audio recordings of some of those 869 phonemes, and you can tell pretty easily that you don't have the ability to discriminate between some of those phonemes. I sure don't, unless you're a native speaker of Hindi. All right, anyway, check out the video. It's pretty cool. Another important building block of language is a morpheme. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in a language. A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in a language. So what in the world does that mean? Well, let's take a look at a couple examples. Maybe it'll make it a little more clear. Phonemes, there are a few phonemes that are morphemes. So the word I or the word those are single phonemes. They also happen to be morphemes. I is a reference to you as an individual. Is a wonderful little grammatical word. We can put multiple morphemes into a single word, and that's usually the case. There's usually more than one morpheme in a word. The word trees has two morphemes. We have the base word tree, a tall, woody plant, either deciduous or coniferous. So that's one morpheme, what a tree is. And then this S on the end makes it plural. That's our second morpheme. That implies that there's more than one. It's not singular, it's plural. So the word trees has two morphemes. You have a tree and you have more than one. Prejudged. This word has three morphemes. We've got the base word judge. We've also got a prefix, pre, and then we've got a suffix, the ed ending, meaning that it happened in the past. At some point in the past, someone or something was judged prematurely. And then you've got words like anti-disestablishmentarianism. That has many morphemes. So hopefully that makes it a little more clear. The smallest unit of meaning is a morpheme. The smallest unit of sound is a phoneme. All right, another important term here, syntax. Syntax refers to the set of rules describing how symbols can be combined. Another word for this would be grammar. So syntax, grammar, for our purposes, we'll say they're the same thing. So these are the rules by which symbols can be combined and still be understood by a listener or a reader. Now, syntax is actually pretty difficult to teach. I know that spell check and grammar check software has come a long way, but it still gets a lot of things wrong. If you've ever been writing in a word processor and you get that little green squiggly line underneath a sentence asking you, like, are you sure this sentence is grammatically correct? And it is. That's a great example of how it's difficult to teach computers what is grammatically correct and what is not. This is also one of those things when, you could be reading a sentence and it just doesn't feel right. You just kind of know when something is wrong, when it doesn't follow syntax rules. And it might not even be something that you can fully explain why it's wrong, but you just know it's wrong. You read the sentence and it just kind of grates on your ears a little bit or something like that. So syntax it's difficult to teach. It's not something that we're born with by any means. It's something that we pick up throughout our life. Now, a key distinction to make in syntax is the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar. So prescriptive grammar is what you learned in 8th grade English class. Those are the rules of language if you want to sound like a proper English gentleman. The difference between who and whom, saying things like I'm well instead of I'm good. Those are all ways to sound very formal, very polite, but those are examples of prescriptive grammar rules. Prescriptive grammar rules are how a language should be used. Now, this is different from descriptive grammar rules. Descriptive grammar is how language is actually used. So, in your normal everyday life, no one really cares if you use the word who or whom incorrectly. No one really cares if you say I'm good instead of I'm well. So there's a pretty big difference between prescriptive and descriptive rules. Again, descriptive is how grammar is actually used. Prescriptive is how it quote unquote should be used. Now, these rules are fluid, they change over time. These rules are not written in stone. They change as societies change, they change as cultures change. So there was a huge push um, for a long time by linguists to try and make these rules more solid, make them widely known, make it more difficult to break them and change them. But that's just not how language is used. These rules need to be fluid because language changes. That's all I'm going to say on that for now, but we'll get a little bit more into that in the next lecture here. All right, so a couple more miscellaneous topics here. First of all, language and speech, they're not the same thing. Language is what we've been talking about. It's that rule-based system of symbolic codes. Speech is the ability to make vocal sounds, to make noises with your vocal cords and your speech system. So, great example of this is ASL. ASL is American Sign Language. There is no speech in ASL, but it is a fully recognized language. It meets all the different criteria for what a language is, but there's absolutely no speech involved in ASL. So language and speech, they're not the same thing. And furthermore, speech is not necessary for intelligence. A while ago, that was thought to be the case, that in order to be intelligent, you needed to be able to speak. An example of this would be Stephen Hawking, very famous astrophysicist, did not have the ability to speak on his own, but you'd be hard pressed to find someone who did not think that Stephen Hawking was an intelligent guy. Moving on to language development. So we have two different types of language, speaking pretty broadly. We have receptive language, which is our ability to understand language, to comprehend language, and this develops first. So when you have little kids, maybe you have your own little kids, maybe you have a really young niece, a really young nephew, and they're just crawling around maybe they're only a year or two old, and you have to watch what you say around them because they can understand you. That's kind of an important moment in a lot of parents' lives when they realize, like, oh, I have to watch what I say around this little crawling critter here. So this differs from productive language, which is the ability to produce language. This develops after receptive language. So once we start comprehending language, the next step is to start producing it. And an important component of learning to produce language is babbling. If you've ever been around, again, your own kid or a young niece or a young nephew, you may be lucky enough to experience the babbling phase. I think you all know what I'm talking about. That's when the little child is blah 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 blah, just kind of running through their paces on their vocal cords. They've got this wonderful new toy which is making a lot of noise, and they're more than happy to use it. It's kind of like just discovering you have this wonderful new ability and just trying to see what you can do with it. But that's actually a really important step in the productive language process. All right, moving on. We are going to finish this lecture on this topic right here, language development. So, big question here is, how do we learn language? It's incredibly important for the human experience. It's incredibly widespread across the globe. It's really important. We would love to understand how we develop these abilities. For a long time, during the behaviorism heyday in psychology, B.F. Skinner was the closest thing to a god in psychology, and he said that verbal behavior, language, is behavior just like any other behavior. It is learned through reinforcement and punishment. So when children babble and they get closer and closer to producing words, parents, whether they know it or not, are actually reinforcing language abilities in that young child. So Skinner said language is not special. It's a behavior just like any other behavior. We can treat it just like a normal behavior. It's nothing special. Now, he had a lot of good points in saying this, and in some respects, he was right. But Noam Chomsky said, "You're way off, bud. Uh, Language is special. There are specialized structures in the brain, in the mind, that cause us to have language abilities." Chomsky went on to say, this is an inborn ability. We will develop language ability. Reinforcement can certainly help, but this is something we're going to learn. This is incredibly important to the human experience, and there's no way that it could just be left to reinforcement and punishment. So we've got these two titans in the field of psychology on opposite ends of this argument. One person, Skinner, is saying that language is based on nurture, and Chomsky is saying that language is based on nature. So, who was right? Well, unfortunately, I think I'm at the end of my lecture here, so I will be right back.